On Tragedy, we cover cases that involve real people and real events. Episodes may include discussions of violence, criminal behavior, and loss. We share these stories to honor those impacted and to raise awareness, but they may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Today, we're pleased to welcome a very special guest to the podcast, Jeni Decker, the creator and host of Down and Away. Jeni is a talented storyteller and investigative podcaster who dives deep into missing persons cases and unsolved mysteries. Since launching Down and Away, Jeni has covered dozens of cases, bringing them to new audiences with empathy, persistence, and a journalist's eye for detail. One of the cases she has covered extensively and with great care is the disappearance of 20-year-old Michael John Olson, who vanished from West Palm Beach, Florida, in December of 1979, along with his maroon Pontiac Grand Prix. Jeni has spent countless hours researching, interviewing, and piecing together the details of Michael's story, bringing awareness to a case that his family has fought for decades to keep alive. Today, we'll hear her insights on this case and take time to discuss and explore some of the unanswered questions that still surround Michael's disappearance. Today, we are speaking with Jeni Decker. Jeni is the host of the podcast Down and Away, and she did a 3-episode series on the missing persons case of John Michael Olson. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Before we talk about your work on Michael John Olson's case and on your podcast, tell us about you and what brought you to podcasting.
So I guess it was around 2013. I lived in a small town in Michigan called Reed City, and I was working on a fiction series and doing some research on it for locations because I wanted to set the story, the fiction story, in a real place. And so I was doing some research into some of the old buildings and stuff in Reed City, and I came across a message board, and it was about a murder that had occurred there in Reed City. And so, of course, then I get distracted and I drop the fiction stuff and I'm reading this whole thread, and it was an actual homicide that had occurred in a small mom and pop type of hardware store in Reed City. And so I got, very into it, and I ended up covering the case. I ended up writing a book about it. And that was it actually ended up being the second season that I did on the podcast. But that's basically what got me into it, because that was the first time I ever sent a FOIA request. It was just one of those things where you gather information more and more and more, and then you're like, well, now I've got to do something because I've got all this information. And, that's what I did. And because it was such a small town, everybody knew about the case. And it was one of those things where I could walk around and talk to everybody while my kids were at school. And so that's where it began.
And so tell us specifically about Down and Away and what kinds of cases you cover on that podcast.
So when I started the podcast, what I wanted to do, my focus was trying to figure out why cases go cold. Because I didn't know a lot about anything. I didn't know a lot about law enforcement. I did not know, even, as far as police reports, didn't really understand, how they work and what you can glean from them and what maybe you can't glean from them and what other documentation you need. So I wanted to learn why cases go cold. And then I only focus on unsolved homicide and missing persons cases. And I generally only take cases that are 70s, 80s, 90s. I don't do many in the 2000s. I've taken a couple because law enforcement, offered that I could work on them. But other than that, I try to stick to the really old ones. And I generally don't like to take a case unless I can get a fair amount of documentation on them. But oftentimes on missing person cases, there isn't a lot. It's just one of those things where you can get 10 or 20 pages and that's it. But generally, I like to do the deep dives where it's more than one episode and cases that you're not going to have ever heard about because they're local to me or local to my state.
Can you tell us how you learned about Michael John Olson's disappearance and what really stood out to you about that disappearance as you went through your series?
Well, so if I'm remembering correctly, I was looking at some other missing persons, and then a lot of times when you're doing that, the other missing persons in counties come up, and I think I saw Mike's case, and then sort of set it aside, finished what I was doing, and then I reached out to Paige, and what sort of stood out was that this kid had really not been in Florida that long, and then suddenly he goes missing, like very short time, and he was so young. Him and his car being missing, all of that together, made a situation where I thought, it stands out in that you're you're likely looking at someone who, with his car, went into the water. But after speaking with Paige and looking at the reports, I thought maybe not. I don't know. So I wanted to figure out as much as I could, track down as many of the people, many of the guys that I could, his friends, and then the friends at the golf club. And so that's what we did. I mean, as soon as I hooked up with Paige, we were sort of off and running. And then we had, this long email chain that included people from the club, us, family members. I mean, there's a lawyer on there. You guys are on there now. I mean, it's a lot of people back and forth batting ideas around and hoping that we can come up with something and get some answers for this family.
Yeah. And so we have had an opportunity, just like you did, to talk with a lot of the same people in this case. And there are some things that just seem sort of conflicting to us. And so we wanted to sort of talk through some of those things with you to see if maybe you can reconcile them for us, or if maybe you also had the same sort of conflicting kind of things.
Okay.
Yeah, like one of the things that came up is, as we're going through things, is where we know that he was in an apartment, and then he moved out to hotel rooms. He was kind of going from hotel room to hotel room for a while, and then he had plans to move in with Brad, as at least one of those guys, to another apartment to share the cost. From what we can gather, he was in there for 8 days. Why would he leave for 8 days? And no one seems to have the answer for that. He was in 8 days. We would assume first and last month rent is paid. So ideally, I would think that moving into these hotel rooms would have cost more money than just staying where he was until the new apartment was arranged.
So where he was staying, so he gets to Florida with his brother on the 14th of November in 1979. And then they spend a week together and they stay at this holiday motel on Okeechobee by the Florida Turnpike. And then once his brother leaves on the 21st, so a week they spend together, once his brother leaves, he's at this Village Green Apartments for a little while. And then the next week, the week that he's going to start working, he's jumping around. And the only thing that Paige and I could come up with is that he's looking for the cheapest place to stay, because we also know that I think his parents sent him some rent money that he had just cashed a check. I believe it was $700
Right.
at the time of his him going missing. So that was the only thing that we can think of. And I don't think the family really knew why he was jumping around either. It's curious to me too. I was curious. They were able to put together a sort of, a calendar of the dates. But the only thing that we could come up with was that he wanted to, he was trying to figure out the cheapest thing. And remember, where he was staying was not close to where he was going to work. So maybe he was jumping around trying to find places that were closer here and there. It really is hard to tell because we just don't know. We don't know why he was jumping around like that.
It was just interesting to me, like when we spoke to Jeff, that, that episode actually, according to the date this is going out, is technically publishing tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we talked to Jeff about was he moved him into an apartment, and we're like, did he choose to break his lease to do this hopping? Which is why I kind of came up with, did he pay first and last month's rent and then leave? And was there something to motivate him to walk away from that money to do this hopping other than the longer drive? Or was that it?
And we don't know if he had the Village Green Apartments could have been a place where they allowed for like weekly stays or something. Maybe it wasn't. I don't know. I don't know if it was an apartment that was an actual apartment complex or those types. Sometimes in Florida, they have, those short stay places. Maybe it was one of those. It could have been,
Yeah, I've been researching. Yeah, that's great. That's great. I've been researching that lately and trying to figure out more about it, even finding out that there is no such thing as the Village Green Apartments. It was actually a nickname for this condominiums in the area. And they definitely were not as close as the Howard Johnson's motel that Chase stayed at that was just south of the golf course.
So they were condominiums, you're saying? The Village Green were condominiums?
Condominiums.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it was that he couldn't get like an apartment there because the normal cost to rent the place for, to live there would have been more. I mean, if he was trying to find a place to live with Brad, it sounds to me like they wanted to chip in expenses, and
Right.
that makes sense because these guys they're not making that much money, So it was probably that he wanted somewhere that he wouldn't be blowing through money, I would imagine, as quickly, especially if he's going out and doing things socially. He hadn't have. Did he even pick up a paycheck? I don't believe he even had picked up, or maybe one paycheck. He hadn't, no, because he was only working. If he worked one day and then there was Thanksgiving, he hadn't even had a full paycheck. So my guess would be he's moving around trying to figure out the best buy, the best bang for his buck, closeness to where he's working, but also if he get right on the turnpike and go somewhere, or, cost wise.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It was one of those things we were trying to line it up because I was like, I got concerned. I was like, if he did pay, as I say, let's assume this was a place that you had to, at least sign a lease at. Why would he walk for money? Was he in fear of something? Was he trying to get away from something that no one's asked that question on?
No, that's a really good question. Yeah, it's a really good question, actually.
I liked your comment as well, because what I can add to my research is, was this a place that you could rent by evening or by week? Correct. I haven't actually asked that question. It took me a while to figure out what the true apartment area was.
Yeah, I left
that
a
name's
message
not used
with them this week.
Yeah.
So hopefully they'll give me a call, but they have super limited hours right now.
Yeah, so it'll be good to hear. I'll be looking forward to what you find out about that, because it's not something I even had thought of. So that's good, because it was the week before. So, but it is, things that happen before are important, because just like, the next week he got a ticket, a speeding ticket, and we don't even know if he was in the car alone or not. We don't know. He was in Fort Lauderdale, right? So we don't know alone what he was doing, and those are the days leading up to him going missing.
Yeah, one of the things that we've kind of learned to start doing based on some of the experts we've talked to already is they remind us when we had a conversation about a different case that, whenever something happens to someone, that's the finality of what occurred, not the beginning.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore, it's really important that you go back a week, go back a month, and try to figure out what steps led to that event. And that would sometimes give you a clue, which is why Elisa made fun of me. I got kind of fixated on this whole apartment idea. So that's been the cornerstone of a lot of my research lately.
Mm-hmm.
No, but it's good, because that's not something any of us have looked into yet. So that's what you want to do. Focus on the stuff that hasn't been dug into. I think that's great. I think you should keep going with that.
Absolutely. So one of the other questions is, and Elisa pointed this out to me, I'm not the golfer, she is. And so we talk about the golf bag being at the hotel room. And if you're playing golf and you belong to a golf club, you would most likely leave your bags at the club. And the only reason you'd have them is if you went and was going to play like a different course or something. But you're also new. And I look at I was explaining to her today, based on my fly fishing experience, for instance, if I was going to fly fish a new area, I would fish that area over and over and over until I got really, really good at that area. And I would assume he probably wouldn't want to play another course yet, because he needs to be an expert at the course he's at to help whatever clients are coming in. So the fact that the bag wasn't at the golf resort is strange to us.
I agree. The only thing I can think of is we know he golfed that day, okay, with some of the guys from work. So what if they're done with golfing, and rather than having to go back to wherever he would dump the golf bags, he just popped it in his car, and they were going to head out to go to that pizza place. It was a pizza joint where they would stop that was close to the president before they headed out. That would be my only thing. And I don't know anything about golf either, but is there anything you need to do to maintain your golf clubs in between games? I don't know. So those are the only two things I can think of. Is there?
Yeah, it's sort of like when people like clean their guns, right? It's not as, you don't have to take things apart, but sometimes, particularly, your irons and your woods are going to have these sets of lines where you strike the ball. And sometimes people will spray those and clean those off because they don't want grass and dirt and things in those. I'm sure there's a particular word for those little lines on the clubs. But I mean, yes, there is something, and you want to, keep them clean. However, like, he would have played golf twice, right? Maybe 3 times since he got there. And I'm sure the opportunity and the equipment that you would want to use to clean those clubs, well, that's already at the course because that's part of the job for a caddy. A caddy has to clean the clubs of the people that he's caddying for. So like all that stuff's going to be at the course. I hear what you're saying, like maybe they were in a rush, right? It was opening night for the kennel club. Maybe they needed to get there at a certain time. And instead of put his clubs where they were supposed to be at the course, let's just go straight to our cars. I just think that's so strange because this was like his thing, right? These were the most important thing to him. And the safest place for them to be is at the club. So I'm like, why are they there?
I agree. And not only were they weren't in his car. They were in his room. Yeah. So it's not like he said, let me lock him in my car until I can get him back to work. He brought them into his room. That question we need to look at when we're also looking at that missing shave bag, that dot bag that his dad asked about, because would he have kept that? That's missing. So would he have kept that in the car if he wouldn't have even kept his, his golf clubs in the car? I mean, he's got him in his clubs in his room. The only thing I could think of is, he worked with him that day. So obviously it's a good question. Why were they at the apartment? At the motel? Why did he take them? It is definitely a good question. And I tell you what, we should ask Brad and Dave and see if either of them have any thoughts about that. They might have some thoughts.
Yeah.
Just based on the layout of the club. Like maybe they'd say, okay, whatever it's called, green or whatever, is far from the thing and he didn't want to have to walk it back. We wanted to, maybe they will be able to offer something.
Yeah, we're definitely going to follow up on that one because we've talked, she and I have talked about that one quite a bit. Another one that comes up, and it's interesting, it depends on who you ask and what piece of paper you read, but people have given us information on who was driving that doesn't line up. Sometimes it's Mike was driving around and they were dropping Jim off. And sometimes when I hear the story, it's Jim was driving around and they were dropping Michael off.
You're talking about the night he disappeared.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right. And first of all, I think Mike would have had the nicer car. He would have had the one, if I'm not mistaken, I heard that Jim had a van. So, and as a matter of fact, I tend to think that Mike was driving because Jim may have tended to drink and didn't want to be the one driving, because I had heard from Rick Jensen that there had been an incident, a DUI incident at one point as well in the van, or an accident or something. So having said that, my guess would be that Mike would be driving because Jim didn't want to drive. Either one to drive. But that again is just a guess. We don't know. And he's saying that he was at Mike's hotel room with him and he had his car at that point, right? He must have followed him to Mike's hotel room, and because then he had to drop it off at the church at some point. So that I find interesting, because if in fact they were going to go from the club, he had to bring, he wanted to get his car closer to home. So he's bringing it they went over to Mike's. Why did they, they could have left in Mike's from the motel. They didn't do that. And my guess is because Jim wanted to get it closest to his house, so that he could just go home later in the evening. But that would mean that they knew, kind of where their night was going to be, all revolving around that small area, kind of going to the track and then those two bars. But if I were to guess, I would say it's because, Mike was driving, and rather than drive around a big old van, and you're going to drink, let the new guy drive around instead.
And he's already maybe on the hook for one DUI, so let's limit the driving.
Yeah, true. I'm not sure if that happened before or after, but I did hear that there was at least one incident. So, that would indicate that might be the reason.
Yeah, one thing we played around with, I was looking at the church parking lot in relation to the track, the golf club, as well as the Howard Johnson. And I was really just fascinated by, why did they park there? Like it's not really the best spot to choose. And so I started researching what that parking lot it was used for back in 1979 outside of the church, and found out that it's actually considered an overflow parking for the Kennel Club. Mm-hmm. And this was opening day for the Kennel Club. Mm-hmm. So it made me wonder if that's legitimately why it was there. Why did they park there? And it's because they couldn't get parking closer to the kennel club.
And it's possible, but like Dave parked at the kennel club. So I don't know if they didn't have parking, because his recollection was that, they met inside, so they would have parked. And he didn't mention parking at the church. He parked at the kennel club, because I even asked him when I interviewed him, do you guys know if you met, do you remember if you met up in the parking lot? He said he, couldn't be sure, but his guess would be that they met up inside. And so maybe it was, but even then, even if it was, Jim's house was so close that if he didn't want to drive at all, why not say, Mike, let's drop my car off at my place. And then he would be assured to not have to drive at all, because he would be dropped off at his house, so it's an interesting question for sure.
Yeah. I was trying to rationalize that too. And the only thing I could come up with, if I'm right, I may not be right about why they parked there, but I was trying to rationalize it. And I was like, I don't know what time the other guys got there. And if they got there earlier, did they have better luck with parking?
That absolutely could be. That could have been absolutely the reason why they did that. Yep.
So let's keep talking about the kennel club.
Okay.
So here's another inconsistency is around if Mike won or lost money at the kennel club, because we're hearing both.
Yeah.
The police report, as you know, Jeni better than us, indicates that he lost $50.
That's right.
Right. Yeah. And that report is dated December 4th, days later, right? So, but the actual morning that everyone at work found out about Mike not being there, as soon as he didn't show up, Brad called Jim and said, "Where's Mike?" And Jim's like, "What do you mean?" And he didn't show up. And so Jim basically told him and used this word, Mike was wheeling trifectas. He was flashing the money around. So he may have won. And, I did the research. There was a possibility he could have been wheeling trifectas, because the number 561, I believe, that came out 3 times. So there is a possibility that he picked those numbers and he was wheeling trifectas and he did win a bunch of money. But the problem is that's not what was told to police when they reported it. What he said was he may have lost $50. That's not just a little and wobble. That's a opposite. That's
180. That's why I hung up on that myself.
Correct. It's the very first thing that doesn't make sense to me. In fact, I'm looking at my notes and that's the first thing on top of it. That doesn't make sense. So I have no answer to that, because how are you going to, there is no way to make sense of that when it's the opposite.
So those are the things we think about, like what, how do I say it? Why would someone report something different than in one case than they do in another case? And what is that behavior telling us about that person?
Right.
That's
and remember,
my mind starts to go.
Yes, because the person reporting it is Jim and Rick Jensen. Okay, so he was the head pro at the time. So the two of them are the ones that talked to police right off the bat. Rick Jensen told me himself that Jim told him that he was wheeling trifectas. So I don't understand how a couple days later we've got he may have lost money. I don't know. I have no idea how it got from one to the other. It doesn't make sense at all. And as far as Rick was concerned, he knew nothing about may have lost $50. He was always told by Jim that it was, he may have won a lot of money because he was wheeling trifectas and he was flashing around his cash. And when I asked Dave about that, the other guy that was there that night, he said he didn't remember any winning, and he didn't remember any flashing of money. So there's inconsistencies.
And you have to ask her, well, to me, that one's hard to get past, because she and I have just talked about that one for hours. But I also want to acknowledge that memory really starts to diminish over the years. Right. I don't feel like there should be something that dramatically different after that kind of time. But I also, one of the things that she and I've talked about is one of the reasons we're looking at all the different case files that we can get now, everything that was collected by his father at the time. And we're even tracking down the recordings that we think we have a beat on now to be able to listen to, because me coming from the data analyst perspective, I talked to a lot of people about what is the source of truth. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're looking at case information that was created as close to 1979 as humanly possible.
Correct.
Because even the interview itself with the person that was there 40 plus years later, there's going to be things they don't remember the same.
Yes. But neither of those things were occurring way later. I mean, that's what he was telling the people in the background. That's what they were being told the next day, the very next, hours after he went missing, hours after he was gone when he didn't show up at 7 a.m. So the stuff that I would tend to not pay attention to is what maybe was being told, timelines and stuff years later. You know what I mean? Like Jim's were a little off, but who's going to remember 2 p.m. versus this p.m., that many years later? You're right that you need to stick with what was happening then and what they were saying then. And because again, memory gets all fuzzy, after decades, and your best information is what you were collecting at that time. I can't wait to find out if you get these recordings, because I know.
As soon as we heard about an option for that, we started exploring it, and we don't have. I don't believe anything until I have it in my hand, but we're being told that we can possibly get those recordings shipped to us. And if that's the case, well, we're going to have a very long weekend of listening and recordings.
I bet you are. That's right.
Because we want to go through all of it. Yeah. But with that said, I mean, you're absolutely right. Because, you even you started to talk about the timelines. And one of the other inconsistencies is, when was Michael supposed to be at work? We've heard, well, you have this.
Yeah, I've heard 7, I've heard 9, and I heard whatever afternoon means.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be good to have that.
Yeah, the report says 7, that he was supposed to show up at 7. I would, in that same narrative, it says 7. I think in a later email, Jim had said 10. And so it is. I would go with what's in that initial report, what time he was supposed to be there, and go from there. And in that small narrative, just on the first page or 2 of the report, there's a couple things that are confusing to me. So the other one was, Jim told police that Mike told him he may be a little late to work on Saturday morning. And that, something about that, it confuses me, because everything that I've heard about the quality of Mike at work is that he would definitely not do that after having only been there a week. Like he would not be strong. He would not go to sleep. He would just show up, before he would not he's not going to tell. The veracity of that, it concerns me, because I can't imagine him saying to Jim, okay, just tell him I'll be in a little late. Like nothing about that feels kosher to me. Now, who knows when that's the other problem I have. Rather than an interview transcript where it's word for word what happened, we are relying on a synopsis. Okay. So you don't even know how the question was asked. You don't know. He could have said, well, he may have said something about, and the other thing we need to remember is there was alcohol on board the night this happened. There's no question about that. How much, we can't say, but when I talked to Dave, he didn't think that Mike was drinking that much. So I don't know about anyone else, but that bothered me. He may be in a little, I don't understand in what context he would have said that. The other thing that I don't understand in what context he would have said is, Jim said that Mike mentioned on that night that he had a 1,200 mile drive ahead of him. What was that? What's the context of that? What do you mean a 1,200 mile trip? Like, no, he talked to his best friend earlier that day. No mention of anything like that. His family, no mention of anything like that. So to me, if he had some trip that he was going on and he said that, is there no curiosity? What do you mean? Where are you going? And he said he didn't know what it was referring to. So these things, to me, they're not enough. Let's just say it that way. There's information with no context and it doesn't make sense. Neither one of those things makes sense to me. So those go on my inconsistencies list. These are the things I want to sew up. If I'm an investigator, I want to clear these up. I want clarity on all of these things, so that I don't feel like, it's things are missing, that I'm only getting part of the story,
Well, yeah, that's one of the reasons we've already reached out to Jim at this point. We haven't heard back from him yet.
And several other people.
Yeah. Because there's so many questions, and the person I'm the most interested in talking to are the person that was with him for the entire evening that we know of.
Right.
And there's also a lot of things that are said that are even flow into other people's accounts that were told to them by Jim. So there's a lot of that narrative that people understand that is from the same source. And so this becomes the most important source of the story.
Right. And then there's one more on my inconsistency list, just one more thing that, along with those that we talked about, is, okay, so Wildsides and Mr. G's were both outside the West Palm Beach jurisdiction. Okay. And then in the investigation, they had a little bit of trouble. You know how it is sometimes. You getting two different agencies to try to work together. Sometimes that's the issue. It didn't sound like it was an issue, but there is something, though, that's important about this. So these bars were in the county jurisdiction. And in 1975, the county had rolled back the hours on the bars within the county from closing from 5 a.m. to 3 a.m. So those bars would have closed at 3 a.m. So why then is Jim dropping him off at 5? What happened in those 2 hours? If the report says the last time he was seen was on 12/1 at 5 a.m. and the two bars that he mentioned closed at 3, what happened in those 2 hours? What's going on there?
These bars aren't far away either.
Right. That's a big hunk of time that's missing. So that's another big concern. What was going on in those 2 hours?
Because even with that, isn't there, well, he was dropped off at 2. No, he was dropped off at 3. No, he was dropped off at 5. And if we actually think that it would be him dropping Jim off because we think that's the car that was in the parking lot at the church. So I feel like there's even inconsistency in the 235 unless you have something conclusive that I may have missed.
No, I mean, I'm looking at the missing person report that says date and time subject was last seen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, that doesn't mean it's really, true, but it says date and time subject last seen 12/1/79 at 5 a.m. So if that's the time that he originally gave to them, then what were they doing for 2 hours if both of those specific clubs were closed? Right. There's time missing, And then we've got the issue with Dave saying the plan was to leave the track and go to Mr. G's. I went and I waited 30, 45 minutes and they never showed up. And that's
they're in separate cars.
Right. Now, could Jim have said after Dave left, hey, let's just go to the strip club. Let's go to Wildsides. Let's not, you know what I mean? Let's go to this club. Sure, they could have, but he didn't tell the police that. If that's what happened, why didn't you tell law enforcement? Oh, we were supposed to go here. We were supposed to go to this place and meet Dave, but we instead went here. So there was stuff missing from the story first given, if in fact it happened as the way he said it happened. That's what the problem is that even if the story that he said is accurate, he didn't give them all the information. Now, was that due to the fact that they were drinking and he was so drunk he didn't remember? A lot of times people withhold stuff simply because they were doing something they weren't supposed to be doing in the first place. And that was being very drunk when they were out. But he wasn't driving. It's not like he did anything wrong. He wasn't the one driving. So unless he was trying not to get Mike in trouble, but at the point where the guy's missing, you think if there's anything else that we don't know about, you think you'd say. So those are the things that all bother me, when they start to pile up. Could each one of those things have an answer? Could they have something that easily explainable? Sure. But when you've got a pile of things and you don't have answers to, you have to kind of take pause a minute. And while this is a case that on its surface looks very much, and I think even all of us still would have went in the water as our number one, because until we can rule everything out, we can't. We've only got one place to rule out as far as I'm concerned, because we had 3 different dive teams that have gone in. Adventures with Purpose looked north Clear Lake. Who was the other one? There was Deepwater Dive did the areas. And then we have, who's now pretty much our go-to people, Sunshine State Sonar, who have gone multiple. All of these guys did multiple dates, and some of them have gone over the other people's work. So except for that one area on Clear Lake, which to this day, I don't understand why it's not been cleared. Unless it has been and we just don't know about it. That would have been my number 2 place, aside from the one area behind the Hojos, because that could, anyone could see, and oh, that could have been somewhere he slid in on the way home accidentally, could be in that one. But my number 2 is always that south section of Clear Lake that's bisected by the causeway or Okeechobee, on either side in case he went off to the right, or if he tried to come back or made a U-turn and went off on the left. I think we need an answer. We need an answer from law enforcement. Has this been cleared? Because if that has been cleared, and if you look at all the other maps and all the other sites that have been searched, I don't think any reasonable person can say he's definitely in the water. I think you have to, at that point, if you clear that, I think you have to start looking in other areas. You deprioritize the water searches now and start prioritizing some other possibility. And law enforcement may be doing that. We have no idea what they're doing.
True.
Yeah, it's good that you brought up the vehicle. And what happened to the vehicle? We have a different missing person case that we've covered, and it's the same situation. We don't just have a missing person. We have a missing person and we have the truck this person was in. And so we have conversations about, I know this isn't grammatically correct, but who can disappear a car and how can you disappear a car? And so water in Florida is pretty typically used for insurance fraud, things like that. And then we've talked about totally dismantling a car, which I guess in 1979 might have been a lot easier than it is now. But, you go down this path of where's the car? And if we can find the car, we will likely find our missing person. And so water is a logical spot. Thus, all the people who've done all the diving in that area. And I think that was the common maybe theory. And people thought, oh, we'll get down there, we'll dive these spots, we'll find the car. This will be, not easy, but, that's the most logical thing. And then it doesn't happen. Right. And so where is that car?
I think that's what surprised people, too, is because when you start thinking about Florida, even something we've learned along our podcasting journey, and we started talking to these different divers, I was shocked at the sheer volume of cars they're pulling out of the water. And so when you start thinking about that fact, you're going, you can't ignore it. So that's why Clear Lake being cleared is so important. And I know I've talked to Mike and Shelley over at Sunshine, and I know they're running into a lot of logistical problems, homeland security for that area of the lake, and that is the holdup. But yeah, I would love to. One of the things that I talked to Shelley about, and this is just me getting into a wild thought process, to be fair, but I started thinking about why it was quarantined off and why you're not allowed to dive it, and a lot of it has to do with the water rules with that particular area and the water supply. But then I'm thinking about, okay, what about the equipment or who maintains the equipment? Somebody's diving. Mm-hmm. So the question is, who is it? And so I'm actually looking at what types of permits are being pulled on that particular watershed, because there has to be dives going on to maintain the equipment that pulls the water out of the lake. There's also environmental studies that are going on with that lake where they're most likely going into the water. I have no information on that yet. That's one avenue that I've been researching.
And I can see why that would be a problem for anyone else, but the sheriff's department wouldn't have should not have any problem getting past any of those issues, permits, whatever. They would know what needs to be done. Why has it not been done? And my suggestion, if I were family, the very first thing I would ask them is I would get a definitive answer. Have you cleared the south end of Clear Lake where it is you need to be very specific so that there's no question where it is. But, have you done this? And if you don't get an answer, why are we not getting an answer? Why is it, if it's not cleared, why is it not cleared? That is let's just start with that question. Let's not even muddy the water and anything else. If you're going to talk to law enforcement and you're hoping to get an answer, ask that one question and see what their response is, and then go from there, because sometimes when you're asking a whole bunch of stuff to law enforcement, that's when you're going to get the no answer at all. But let's just start with one thing. And I know the family has reached out. We should have the answer to this is the point. We should have the answer to that question by now.
Well, yeah, they're at least what they've illustrated to us is that West Palm Beach Police Department has not been super cooperative. And Sunshine State Sonar told us the same. Mm-hmm. In fact, they were told they were basically threatened for being arrested if they didn't leave the area as far as diving in certain areas. And that even going and standing next to the water in the south side of the lake equaled law enforcement coming to visit.
Yeah, that happened to Brent that weekend that we all went down there. They were like on the way out going to just try to do it. We couldn't. They were just going to try to go in there and just do it. And they were not there very long. And the police rolled right up. So okay, that's fine. But great, I'm glad you're protecting it. That doesn't have anything to do with why you, the sheriff's department, who has a dive team that's perfectly capable of doing it, haven't done it. Unless they have, and they haven't told us. My concern is they don't want to. They have, and they don't want to tell us because then they know it's going to send us off on another tangent, which means maybe he's not in the water. That then it starts us digging. You know what I mean? I don't know what else. What other reasonable explanation is there? It's hard to fathom. So, that is frustrating to me, and I'm sure it's frustrating to the Olsons.
Yeah. Anyway, I guess my final question is there anything about the case itself that, we haven't talked about today that you think is particularly interesting and something we should, dig into more?
I can't really think of anything because we've talked on here and before. I can't really think of anything. I think the only thing I would like everybody to know is that you've spoken to the family now. We've all spoken to the family. They're a really sweet group of people. They're just grateful for any moment you'll give to them. They're just, they don't assume anything. They're just kind and decent. And I've covered a lot of cases, and people get upset, they get choked up, they cry. This case, there were more men, grown adult men, crying to me and Paige than any other case I've ever covered. This touched all of these men so much, even the guys that only had known him a week and a half, 9 days. It has decimated them in some way because, and really that is what ambiguous loss does. When you have no answer, it's worse almost than a definitive, okay, he died. You don't know. And I think we all hoped, I know Paige and I, that it would be a water situation where we find him and the vehicle, and because that would mean that no harm befell their son at the hand of someone else. It was an accident. It was terrible. That would be the optimum answer to this, but no answer is just, it's, catastrophic to family members.
Yeah.
There's no other word. So if anyone has any information, I would hope that you get in touch with the West Palm Beach Police Department, get in touch with the family, get in touch with me, get in touch with these guys here on the podcast, whoever you feel comfortable, if you have any information. The problem is that this wasn't a situation where Mike had ties with anybody here. He was only in town for 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. So he hadn't even, if you're going to start looking at foul play, he hadn't even been there long enough to upset anybody. If there was no one at work that was going to be like, oh, he's stealing my job, because they all had these jobs. It was a busy time. They had to hire people from, out of state. That's what it was. There was literally nothing that occurred with him at that point that anyone would have be upset with him. So there are very limited possibilities. He's in the water or something happened that night, something that we do not yet know. Those are really the only options here. He did not, what he did not do. Mike Olson did not leave town and start a new life. Let's just dispense with any idea of that. That did not happen. So, and it gets frustrating to me when that is even brought up. That did not happen. He was very close to his family. There was no reason for him to go missing and start a new life, and that didn't happen. So our possibilities are very small, and I would like to get that last bit of Clear Lake ruled out so that they can start looking at things that are not that, and I hope that
same here.
Doing. Yeah, I hope that that's what they're doing.
You've been listening to Tragedy, a true crime podcast. Our purpose is to honor victims by sharing their stories through the voices of friends, family, and those whose lives were forever changed. If today's episode resonated with you, we encourage you to follow, leave a review, and share the podcast so these important stories continue to be heard. Together, we can preserve their memories and ensure their voices are never forgotten. If you have ideas for cases we should cover or questions about what you heard, you can connect with us through our Facebook group, Tragedy, a True Crime Podcast, on X @Tragedy Podcast, by email, tragedy, a true crime podcast @gmail.com, or by visiting our website, www.tragedyaTruecrimepodcast.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time.